For 72 years of my life, whenever someone asked me about my father, I would look them straight in the eye and say the same lie. I don't have a father. I said it so many times that sometimes I almost believed it myself. But tonight, as I sit here in my old rocking chair on this front porch in Montgomery, Alabama, watching the sun paint the sky orange and pink, I know it is time to tell you the truth. Because what happened to me, what I lived through, and what I discovered about forgiveness, well, it might just change your life the way it changed mine. My name is Dorothy Mae Williams, and I am about to share with you the most painful and beautiful story of my life. It's a story about a little girl who grew up so scared and hurt that she spent decades pretending her own father never existed. It's about wounds so deep that they shaped every relationship, every decision, every moment of my life for more than 50 years. But most importantly, it's about how God showed me that even the deepest pain can become the source of the greatest healing. You see, there was a reason I told people I had no father. There was a reason why, every time someone mentioned family gatherings or Father's Day, or even just asked simple questions about where I came from, my heart would start racing and my hands would shake. There was a reason why I built walls so high around my heart that even my own children wondered why Mama seemed so distant sometimes. Why I flinched when men raised their voices. Why I never talked about my childhood. That reason was Charles Williams. A man who stood 6 feet and 3 inches tall, with hands like hammers and a voice that could shake the walls of our little house. A man who came back from World War II with medals on his chest and demons in his soul. A man who was supposed to protect me, love me, guide me, but instead became the source of my deepest pain. Now, before I go any further, I want to ask you something. If this story is touching your heart already, if you've ever felt that kind of pain where you wished you could just erase someone from your existence, please take a moment to subscribe to our channel. Share your own story in the comments below. Tell us where you're watching from, because stories like this, they connect us all. We all have wounds. We all have people who hurt us, and sometimes we all need to know we are not alone in this journey. Your support means the world to us, and who knows? Your story might be exactly what someone else needs to hear today. But let me take you back to where it all began. Montgomery, Alabama, 1953. The year I was born into a world that seemed determined to teach me that love came with conditions, that safety was never guaranteed, and that sometimes the people who are supposed to love you the most are the ones who hurt you the deepest. Mama always said I was born during a thunderstorm, and looking back now, I think that storm never really ended. It just moved inside our house and took up residence in the form of a man who couldn't find peace after the war. So he made sure nobody else in our family could find it either. I remember the smell of our house back then. It was always a mixture of Mama's cornbread baking in the oven, the old wood polish she used on our furniture, and something else. Something I could not name as a child, but now I know was fear. Fear has a smell, you know. It's sharp and metallic, like pennies left out in the rain. Our house was small but sturdy, built by my grandfather, sewn hands back in 1928. It had creaky wooden floors that would announce every footstep, thin walls that carried every whisper and every shout, and windows that Mama kept covered with heavy curtains because Daddy said he didn't like people looking in. But I think the real reason was that he didn't want people looking out either. He didn't want anyone to see what was happening inside. The living room was dominated by Daddy's big brown leather chair, the one he claimed when he came back from Europe. It sat right in front of our old television set, positioned so he could see both the TV and the front door at the same time. Mama always said he needed to see the exits, that it was something from the war. But for me, that chair became a symbol of something else entirely. When Daddy was in that chair, the whole house held its breath. Mama, bless her heart, was a tiny woman with gentle hands and eyes that seemed to apologize for everything, even things that weren't her fault. Her name was Helen, but Daddy always called her Woman, like she didn't deserve a name of her own. She spent her days cooking, cleaning, and trying to keep me quiet and out of Daddy's way. She had this nervous habit of smoothing down her apron over and over when she was scared, which meant her apron was smooth pretty much all the time. And me? I was just a little girl trying to figure out why the man who was supposed to love me seemed to hate everything about me. Why my laughter made him angry. Why my questions annoyed him. why my very existence seemed to be a disappointment he couldn't get over. Daddy worked at the lumber mill on the other side of town, coming home every evening covered in sawdust and sweat, carrying the weight of whatever demons had followed him back from France. He never talked about the war, not directly, but sometimes at night I would hear him talking to himself in the living room, having conversations with people who weren't out there, arguing with ghosts that only he could see. The first memory I have of understanding that my family wasn't TT like other families was when I was about 5 years old. My friend Jenny from down the street had invited me to her birthday party, and when I asked Mama if I could go, she got that worried look in her eyes and said, "We'd have to ask Daddy." I can still picture that moment like it happened yesterday. Daddy was sitting in his chair, reading the evening paper, when Mama approached him with me hiding behind her skirts. "Charles," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "Dorothy has been invited to Jenny's birthday party on Saturday afternoon." Daddy didn't even look up from his paper. "No," he said, flat and final. "But Daddy," I said, stepping out from behind Mama, "all the other kids are going, and Jenny's Mama said there would be cake and that S when he looked at me, really looked at me. His eyes were gray like storm clouds, and when they focused on you, it felt like being caught in a lightning storm." I said no, he repeated, his voice getting that edge that made my stomach hurt. "And when I say no, I mean no. Children should be seen and not heard, especially little girls who don't know their place." I didn't understand what he meant about knowing my place, but I understood the tone. I understood that asking questions was wrong. I understood that wanting things was wrong. I understood that somehow just being me was wrong. That night, I lay in my little bed with its patchwork quilt that Mama had made from old dresses, and I heard them arguing in the kitchen. Mama's voice was soft and pleading. Daddy's was hard and angry. I couldn't make out all the words, but I heard enough to know they were arguing about me, about the party, about why I couldn't just be like other children. "She needs friends, Charles," Mama was saying. "She needs to be around other children." "What she needs," Daddy replied, "is to learn that life isn't a party. What she needs is to understand that the world doesn't owe her anything, and the sooner she learns that, the better off she'll be." I pulled my pillow over my head and tried to block out their voices, but Daddy's words had already found their way into my heart. The world doesn't owe her anything. Even at 5 years old, I somehow understood that he was talking about more than just birthday parties. He was talking about love, about kindness, about all the things that other children seem to get from their fathers without even asking. As the months and years went by, that pattern repeated itself over and over. Every request denied, every small joy dismissed, every attempt at childhood happiness met with disapproval or anger. I learned to stop asking for things. I learned to make myself small and quiet and invisible, hoping that if I just took up less space in the world, maybe Daddy would find less to be angry about. But children aren't meant to be invisible. Children are meant to laugh and play and ask a million questions and make messes and dream big dreams. So when I tried to squash all of that down inside myself, it had to come out somewhere. And where it came out was in my imagination. I created a whole world in my head where I had a different father. A father who smiled when he saw me, who asked about my day, who taught me things and took me places and told me he was proud of me. I would spend hours playing by myself in our small backyard, having conversations with this imaginary father, telling him about school and my friends and my dreams. One day, when I was about 7, Mama caught me having one of these conversations. I was sitting under our old oak tree, talking animatedly to empty air about a drawing I had made at school. "Who are you talking to, sweetheart?" Mama asked, sitting down beside me in the grass. "My real daddy," I said without thinking. "The one who loves me." Mama's face went pale, and she looked around nervously to make sure Daddy wasn't anywhere nearby. "Dorothy," she said, taking my hands in hers. "Your daddy, he does love you. He just doesn't know how to show it. The war, it changed him. He's not the same man I married." "What was he like before?" I asked, suddenly desperate to know if there had ever been a version of my father who could have loved me the way I needed to be loved. Mama's eyes got misty, and for a moment she looked like she was seeing something far away. "He was kind," she whispered. He laughed at my jokes. He talked about the children we would have someday, about teaching them to fish and taking them to the county fair. He used to say he couldn't wait to be a father. "What happened to that daddy?" I asked. Mama was quiet for a long time, watching the leaves rustle overhead. Finally, she said, "Sometimes when people see too much sadness, too much pain, they forget how to see the good things. They get stuck in the darkness and can to find their way back to the light." I thought about that conversation for years, trying to understand what Mama meant. I tried to imagine my father as a young man, full of hope and dreams, excited about having a family. But that image never quite connected with the reality of the man who came home every night and seemed to see me as nothing more than a burden, an interruption, a constant reminder of responsibilities he never wanted. The worst part was, to even the anger, though there was plenty of that, the worst part was the indifference. When Daddy was angry, at least I knew he saw me. But most of the time, he looked right through me like I wasn't even there. I could walk into a room where he was sitting and he wouldn't acknowledge my presence. I could say good morning and he wouldn't respond. I could try to show him a good grade on a test and he would just keep reading his newspaper like I hadn't spoken. That indifference taught me something terrible about myself, that I was forgettable, unimportant, not worth noticing. And once a child learns that lesson, it becomes part of how they see themselves for the rest of their lives. By the time I was 10 years old, I had developed what I now recognize as a coping mechanism. When other children at school talked about their fathers, when teachers asked about family, when anyone mentioned dads in any context, I would simply say, "I don't have a father." It was easier than trying to explain why my father didn't come to school plays or why he never taught me to ride a bike or why I flinched every time I heard heavy footsteps on a wooden floor. The first time I said it, I was talking to my 4th grade teacher, Mrs. Johnson. She was a kind woman with silver hair and gentle hands who reminded me of the grandmother I had never known. She was helping me with a family tree project, asking about relatives and their occupations. "And what does your father do for work, Dorothy?" she asked, pencil poised over the paper. Without thinking, I said, "I don't have a father." Mrs. Johnson, his face filled with sympathy. "Oh, sweetheart, I am so sorry. When did he pass away?" I had not thought that far ahead. "A long time ago," I said, which wasn't exactly a lie. The father I needed, the father I dreamed of, had never existed. So, in a way, he had passed away a long time ago. "Well," Mrs. Johnson said gently, "we can just focus on your mother and your side of the family then." And that was how it started. That was how I began erasing Charles Williams from my story, one conversation at a time. It felt like taking off shoes that were too tight. Suddenly, I didn't have to explain anything. I didn't have to make excuses for why my father never came to school events or why I never talked about him. I was just a girl being raised by her mother, and people understood that. They felt sorry for me, but in a way that felt better than the confusion and judgment I imagined they would feel if they knew the truth. But lies, even lies that feel like protection, have a way of growing heavier over time. Every time someone expressed sympathy for my loss, every time a friend's father was kind to me out of pity for the poor girl without a dad, every time I had to keep track of my story and make sure I didn't contradict myself, that weight grew heavier. And at home, the reality of Charles Williams continued to shape every day of my life. His presence filled our house like smoke, getting into everything, making it hard to breathe. Mama and I learned to move around him carefully, to gauge his mood from the sound of his footsteps, to communicate with each other in glances and whispers when he was in one of his dark periods. Those dark periods seemed to come more frequently as I got older. Maybe it was because I was becoming more of a person with opinions and questions and needs. Maybe it was because the war demons were getting stronger. Maybe it was because he was drinking more. Or maybe it was just because some people are broken in ways that cannot be fixed, and they break everything around them without meaning to. But one thing I knew for certain, even as a child, I was living in a house with a man who was supposed to love me, and instead of love, there was only silence, anger, and a kind of sadness so deep it seemed to have no bottom. And somewhere in my young heart, I had already made a decision that would shape the next 6 decades of my life. I decided that if I couldn't have the father I needed, then I would simply pretend I had no father at all. It seemed like the safest choice, the choice that would hurt the least, But what I didn't understand then was that some choices, even the ones that feel like protection, can become prisons that lock us away from the very healing we need most. As I sit here now, remembering that scared little girl who thought the best solution was to erase her own father from existence, my heart breaks for her. She was just trying to survive in the only way she knew how. She couldn't have known that this decision would follow her into every relationship, every conversation about family, every moment when someone asked her where she came from. She couldn't have known that denying the existence of Charles Williams would also mean denying parts of herself, the parts that carried his features, his mannerisms, his genetic legacy. She couldn't have known that running from the truth would become a pattern that would shape her entire approach to pain and conflict for the next 50 years. And she certainly couldn't have known that one day, when she was an old woman sitting on a porch in Montgomery, she would finally understand that the father she had spent so many years denying was about to teach her the most important lesson of her life. A lesson about forgiveness, about healing, about the kind of love that can transform even the deepest wounds into sources of strength. But that revelation was still decades away. For now, there was just a 10-year-old girl learning to lie about her own life, thinking she was protecting herself, not knowing that some protections become prisons, and some prisons take a lifetime to escape. By the time I was 13, something happened that would change everything about how I saw my father and myself. It was an evening I'll never forget, the night I realized that my lie had become more real to me than the truth. I was doing homework at our kitchen table when Daddy came home from the mill. He was later than usual, and I could smell the alcohol on him before he even made it through the door. Mama was at her church ladies' meeting, so it was just the two of us in that house with its thin walls and heavy silence. He stood in the kitchen doorway for a long moment, looking at me like he was trying to remember who I was. Then, out of nowhere, he said, "You look just like her, you know." "Like who, Daddy?" I asked, not looking up from my math homework. "Your mama, when she was young." His voice was different that night, softer somehow, like the alcohol had worn down some of his usual hardness. She was the prettiest girl in 3 counties. I looked up at him then, surprised by this unexpected moment of conversation. "Really? Really?" He sat down heavily in the chair across from me, something he had never done before. "She chose me, though. Said she could see something good in me that nobody else could see." He laughed, but it wasn't a happy sound. Guess she was wrong about that. For just a moment, sitting there in our kitchen with the yellow lamplight making everything look warmer than it actually was, I saw a glimpse of the man Mama had described. The man who had wanted to teach his children to fish, who had dreamed of taking them to county fairs. "Daddy," I said carefully, "what was the war like?" His face changed immediately, all that temporary softness disappearing like it had never been there at all. "You don't ask about that," he said, standing up so quickly that his chair scraped against the floor. "Some things are meant to stay buried." He left the kitchen then, and I heard him go into the living room and turn on the television louder than necessary. But before the sound of gunfire from his Western show drowned out everything else, I heard something that made my blood run cold. I heard him crying. It was quiet, the kind of crying that comes from someone who has forgotten how to do it properly. But it was definitely crying. And in that moment, I understood something that my 13-year-old mind could barely process. My daddy was as broken as I was, maybe more broken. But instead of making me feel sympathy for him, that realization made me angry. Angrier than I had ever been in my young life. Because if he was hurting, if he was carrying pain from the war, then why did he have to make Mama and me hurt too? Why couldn't he get help? Why couldn't he try to be better? That night, lying in my bed and listening to him talk to his ghosts in the living room, I made a decision that would shape my life for years to come. I decided that not only would I continue to tell people I had no father, but I would also start believing it myself, completely and totally. Charles Williams wasn't my father. He was just a man who lived in our house, a stranger who happened to share my last name. My real father, the one who mattered, was gone, had always been gone, and I was going to stop waiting for him to come back. It was a decision born out of self-preservation, but it was also a decision that would cost me more than I could possibly imagine. Because when you decide to erase someone from your life, you don't just lose them. You lose all the possibilities they carried, all the potential for healing, all the chances for understanding. But I was 13 years old, And 13-year-olds didn't know about things like forgiveness and redemption. All I knew was that it hurt less to pretend he didn't exist than to keep hoping he might someday become the father I needed. What I didn't know was that those walls I was building to keep the pain out would also keep the healing out. And what I definitely didn't know was that the man I was trying so hard to erase from my existence would one day, in his final moments, give me the greatest gift of my life. But that is a story for another part of this journey. Right now, I need to tell you about the years that came next, about how a lie can become a way of life, and how sometimes the things we do to protect ourselves become the very things that trap us in cycles of pain we never meant to create. Trap us in cycles of pain we never meant to create. Because that is exactly what happened to me in the years that followed. What started as a simple lie to protect a broken heart became a web so complicated that I almost lost myself completely in it. High school should have been a time of discovery, of figuring out who I was and what I wanted from life. Instead, it became 4 years of perfecting the art of deception. By the time I was 14, I had become so good at my story that even I sometimes forgot it wasn't true. When guidance counselors asked about family background for college applications, when friends wondered why I never talked about my dad, when boys I dated asked to meet my parents, I had an answer ready. My father passed away when I was young, became my automatic response. It is just me and my mama now. The sympathy that followed was both a comfort and a curse. Teachers gave me extra attention. Friends, families invited me to dinner more often. And everyone treated me with the kind of gentle kindness reserved for those who had suffered loss. But with each act of kindness came another weight on my shoulders, another lie to keep track of. At home, the reality was becoming harder to bear. Daddy Ice drinking had gotten worse, and with it, his anger. Mama had started working at the local diner, which meant I was alone with him more often. Those hours between school and when Mama returned became a daily test of survival. I learned to read the signs like a weather forecast. The sound of his truck in the driveway told me everything I needed to know about what kind of evening we were going to have. Our house had become a place where silence was survival. Mama and I communicated in glances and gestures, speaking only when absolutely necessary and always in whispers when Daddy was home. We moved through those rooms like ghosts, trying not to disturb the angry spirit that had taken residence in what should have been our sanctuary. But teenagers aren't meant to live like ghosts. We are meant to be loud and messy and full of questions and dreams. So all that energy I was suppressing at home had to go somewhere. And where it went was into a desperate desire to escape. By my junior year, I had decided that the only way out was marriage. It wasn't romantic like other girls imagined. It was practical, a business decision made by a 17-year-old girl who had run out of options for feeling safe. When Robert Johnson entered my life. He was 21, worked at the auto repair shop downtown, and had kind eyes that reminded me of the father I had imagined in my childhood fantasies. Robert was the sort of man who opened doors for ladies, who said, "Yes, ma, am," and "No, sir," who went to church on Sundays. When he asked me to the spring dance, I said yes, not because I was in love, but because I saw in him a chance at the kind of life I had been dreaming about since I was 7 years old, sitting under our oak tree. Robert was everything Daddy wasn't. He listened when I talked. He laughed at my jokes. He told me I was pretty and smart and worth something. When he held my hand, I felt safe in a way I had never experienced before. When he talked about the future, about the house we might live in and the children we might have, I could almost forget that I was carrying secrets that felt too heavy for my 17-year-old shoulders. But secrets have a way of making themselves known, especially when you are trying to build a relationship on a foundation of lies. The first time Robert asked about meeting my parents, I told him my usual story. We were sitting in his truck outside the movie theater, sharing a bag of popcorn and talking about our favorite films, when he said, "I'd like to meet your folks, Dorothy. Ask your mama his permission to court you proper." "My father passed away when I was young," I said, the words coming out as automatically as breathing. "It is just me and mama now." Robert's face filled with the familiar sympathy I had seen so many times before. "I'm sorry, honey. That must have been real hard on you." "It was," I said, which wasn't exactly a lie. Losing the father I needed had been one of the hardest things I had ever experienced. even if he had never actually existed. "Well then," Robert said, "I'd be honored to meet your mama and ask her permission." Panic rose in my throat like bile. How could I explain that Mama barely spoke above a whisper? How could I invite this kind, gentle man into our house where fear lived in every corner? How could I let him see the truth about the family I came from? "She is real shy," I said quickly. "Works long hours at the diner. Maybe we could wait a little while before you meet her." Robert smiled and squeezed my hand. "Of course, honey. We'll take it slow. No rush at all." But there was a rush, at least in my mind. Every day I stayed in that house was another day of walking on eggshells, another day of pretending to be invisible, another day of listening to Daddy's angry words and Mama as apologetic silences. I needed out, and Robert was my way out. We got engaged on my 18th birthday. Robert gave me a small diamond ring that had belonged to his grandmother, and when he slipped it on my finger in the parking lot of the diner where Mama worked, I felt like I was finally going to have the life I had always dreamed of. "We don't have to have a big wedding," I told him. "Just something small, simple." "Whatever you want, honey," he said. "As long as you're my wife, I don't care if we get married in a courthouse or a cathedral." We were married 6 weeks later in a small ceremony at the Justice of the Peace, with Robert's family and a few friends as witnesses. Mama came, wearing her best dress and that nervous smile she wore when she was trying to pretend everything was fine. Daddy didn't come. I told Robert he was working, but the truth was, I never even told him about the wedding. Standing there in that small courthouse, promising to love and honor Robert Johnson for the rest of my life, I felt like I was finally escaping the prison that had been my childhood. I was starting fresh, starting clean, starting with a man who would never hurt me the way Daddy had hurt Mama and me. But what I didn't understand then was that you can start fresh when you were carrying secrets that heavy. You cannot build a new life on a foundation of lies without those lies eventually cracking everything you were trying to build. The first few years of our marriage were the happiest of my life up to that point. Robert was everything I had hoped he would be and more. He was patient and kind and gentle. He worked hard at the garage and came home every evening with stories about his day and questions about mine. He never raised his voice, never made me feel small, never looked at me like I was a disappointment. We rented a little house on Elm Street, just 3 blocks from the church where we had started attending services together. It had 2 bedrooms, a kitchen with yellow curtains that I had sewn myself, and a front porch where we would sit in the evenings and talk about our dreams. Our first child, Michael, was born when I was 20. Holding that tiny baby in my arms, I made a promise that I would never let anyone hurt him the way Daddy had hurt me. I would be the kind of mother who protected her children, who made them feel safe and loved and wanted. 2 years later, we had Sarah, and then 3 years after that came little James. Our house on Elm Street filled up with the sounds that houses are supposed to have. Children laughing, toys scattered on the floor, family dinners around the kitchen table. Watching him with our children, seeing the way they lit up when he came home from work, hearing them call him Daddy with such love and trust in their voices, I felt grateful in ways I couldn't even put into words. My children would never know what it felt like to be afraid of their father. They would never have to learn to make themselves invisible or to lie about their family to avoid pain. But they also would not know anything about their grandfather. Because how could I tell them about Charles Williams when I had spent so many years insisting he didn't exist? When Michael started asking questions about Daddy's family, Robert would tell stories about his own father and grandfather, about family traditions and holiday memories. But when the children asked about my side of the family, I would get that familiar tightness in my chest and say something vague about how it was just me and Grandma Helen, that my daddy had passed away before they were born. What was Grandpa like? Sarah asked me one day when she was about 6 years old. We were looking through old photo albums, and she had noticed that all the pictures of Mama and me together never included a man. He was gone before you could meet him, I said, which was true in the only way that mattered to me. But what was he like when he was alive? She persisted with the innocent curiosity that only children possess. I stared at that photo album, at pictures of Mama and me at church picnics and school events, and realized that I had no idea how to answer that question. How could I describe a man I had spent so many years trying to forget? How could I tell my daughter anything meaningful about her grandfather when I had worked so hard to erase him from my own story? He was complicated, I finally said. Some people are just complicated, baby girl. Sarah seemed satisfied with that answer, but I wasn't. Lying to my children felt different than lying to teachers or friends or even Robert. These were my babies, the people I loved most in the world, and I was building our family's foundation on the same lies that had shaped my entire adult life. But the alternative, telling them the truth about Charles Williams, about the house where fear lived, about why I had chosen to pretend my own father didn't exist, seemed impossible. How do you explain to your children that their grandfather was alive, but so broken that you had to erase him to survive? So I kept the secret, and with each passing year, it grew heavier. The weight of it started affecting my marriage in ways I did not understand at first. Robert was a good man, but he was also a man who believed in honesty and family and facing problems head on. He couldn't understand why I never wanted to visit Mama, why I got nervous whenever anyone asked about my childhood, why I seemed to shut down whenever the conversation turned to family history. "There is something you are not telling me," he said to me one evening when we had been married about 10 years. The children were asleep, and we were sitting on our front porch like we did most nights. But instead of our usual comfortable silence, there was tension in the air. "What do you mean?" I asked, though my heart was already racing. "About your family, about your father. Every time anyone mentions him, you get this look in your eyes like you were somewhere else entirely." I stared out at the street, watching fireflies blink in the darkness, and tried to figure out how to respond. Part of me wanted to tell him everything, to finally share the burden I had been carrying alone for so many years. But the bigger part of me was terrified that if he knew the truth, he would see me differently. He would understand that I wasn't the strong, independent woman he had married, but just a scared little girl who had never learned how to trust anyone completely. "Some things are better left in the past," I said finally. "Not when they are reaffecting our present," Robert replied gently. "I love you, Dorothy, but sometimes I feel like I am married to a woman who is only showing me half of herself." His words hit me like a physical blow because they were true. I had been so focused on protecting myself from the pain of my childhood that I had also protected myself from the possibility of being fully known and loved. I had built walls around my heart that were so high and so strong that even Robert, with all his patience and kindness, couldn't find a way over them. That night, lying in bed beside my husband while he slept, I realized that my father's damage had followed me even here, even into this safe place I had tried to create. The lies I had told to protect myself had become barriers between me and the people I loved most. But still, I couldn't bring myself to tell the truth. The secret felt too big, too shameful, too dangerous to share. What if Robert couldn't understand? What if he thought less of me for lying all these years? What if he realized that the woman he had married was built on a foundation of deception? So instead of talking, I started pulling away. I became more distant, more guarded, more careful about what I shared and what I kept to myself. I threw myself into being a mother and keeping house, focusing all my energy on my children and trying to ignore the growing distance between Robert and me. It was around this time, when I was about 45 years old and feeling more lost than I had since I was a teenager, that something happened that would change the direction of my entire life. Mama, who had been struggling with her health for several months, had a heart attack and ended up in the hospital. I spent 3 days sitting beside her bed, watching her sleep, thinking about all the things we had never talked about. Mama had carried her own secrets, her own pain, her own regrets about the choices she had made and the life she had lived. Looking at her lying there so small and fragile, I realized that we had both been prisoners in that house with Charles Williams, and we had both found our own ways to survive. On the 3rd day, she woke up and looked at me with eyes that were clearer than they had been in years. "Dorothy," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "you can keep running from him forever." "I don't know what you mean, Mama." "Yes, you do." She reached for my hand with fingers that felt as light as bird bones. "You've been running from your daddy your whole life, but running does not heal anything. It just makes the hurt follow you wherever you go. He hurt us, Mama. He hurt us both." "Yes, he did." But he was hurting too, baby girl. That doesn't make what he did right, but it makes him human. And as long as you keep pretending he doesn't exist, you are going to keep carrying his pain around with you. That conversation stayed with me long after Mama recovered and went home. For the first time in decades, I started thinking about Charles Williams not as the monster from my childhood, but as a broken man who had passed his brokenness on to his family. I started wondering what it might feel like to stop running, to stop lying, to stop pretending that half of my history had never happened. It was during this time of questioning and confusion that I found myself walking into the small Baptist church that Robert had been attending since we moved to Elm Street. I had gone to services with him occasionally over the years, more out of social obligation than any real spiritual seeking. But that Sunday morning felt different. Pastor James Davidson was a man in his early 60s with silver hair and kind eyes who reminded me of the grandfather I had never known. His sermon that day was about forgiveness, about the ways that carrying anger and resentment can poison our hearts and relationships. Forgiveness, he said, his voice carrying easily through the small sanctuary. Isn't it something we do for the people who hurt us? It is something we do for ourselves. It is how we break free from the prison of our own pain. Sitting in that wooden pew, listening to those words, I felt something crack open inside my chest. For the first time in my adult life, I allowed myself to consider the possibility that there might be another way to deal with the pain I had been carrying for so long. After the service, I found myself walking up to Pastor James, though I am not sure I had consciously decided to do so. "Pastor," I said, my voice shaking slightly, Could I talk to you sometime? About forgiveness?" He smiled with the kind of warmth that I remembered from Mama's eyes before Daddy, as anger had dimmed them. "Of course, child. Anytime you need." That conversation, which took place the following Tuesday in his small office behind the sanctuary, was the beginning of what I can only describe as my spiritual awakening. For the first time in my life, I talked to another human being about the weight I had been carrying, about the lies I had told, about the father I had spent decades trying to erase. Pastor James listened without judgment, nodding occasionally, asking gentle questions that helped me dig deeper into feelings I had buried for so long. He didn't try to minimize my pain or excuse my father Joach's behavior. Instead, he helped me understand that healing and forgiveness were possible even in the face of deep wounds. "Your father's choices dawned to define you, Dorothy," he said during one of our sessions. "But your choices about how to respond to his choices, those do define you." "I don't know how to forgive him," I admitted. "I don't even know how to think about him without feeling angry or scared." "Forgiveness is a process," Pastor James said gently. "It doesn't happen all at once, and it doesn't mean pretending that what happened didn't hurt you. It means choosing to release the hold that anger has on your heart." Over the following months, through prayer and counseling and slowly examining the wounds I had carried for so long, I began to understand that the prison I thought I had escaped when I married Robert was still there. I had just built it around my heart instead of living in a physical house. The lies I had told about my father, the secrets I had kept from my husband and children, the walls I had built to protect myself, they had all become bars that kept me trapped in a half-life where I could never be fully known or fully loved. And somewhere in those months of spiritual searching, I began to understand that if I wanted to be free, really free, I was going to have to do the thing that scared me most in the world. I was going to have to face Charles Williams again. Not as the terrified child I had been, but as the woman I had become. I was going to have to tell the truth about who he was, who I was, and what had happened in that house where fear lived. I was going to have to choose forgiveness, even though I wasn't sure I knew how. But first, I had to figure out how to tell my family that the man I had claimed was gone had been alive all along. I had to find a way to explain why I had built our entire family story on a lie. The truth was waiting for me, and it was time to stop running from it. But as I sat in that small church office, feeling both terrified and hopeful for the first time in decades, I had no idea that the opportunity to face my father would come sooner than I expected. All I knew was that God was calling me towards something that felt both impossible and necessary, something that would either break me completely or finally set me free. And for the first time in my adult life, I was ready to find out which one it would be. And for the first time in my adult life, I was ready to find out which one it would be. The phone call came on a Tuesday morning in March, while I was folding laundry in my kitchen and listening to the birds sing outside my window. It was Mama S' voice on the other end, shaky and small in a way that immediately made my stomach drop. "Dorothy," she said, "your daddy, he in the hospital." I stood there holding one of Robert S' work shirts, feeling the world tilt sideways. "What happened, Mama?" "Pneumonia, real bad this time. The doctors, they were saying..." Her voice broke, and I heard her take a shuddering breath. "They were saying he might not make it, baby girl. For 72 years, I had been telling people my father was gone. And now, suddenly, he really might be." The irony wasn't lost on me, sitting there in my sunny kitchen with the phone pressed to my ear and my heart racing like I was that scared little girl again. "How long does he have?" I asked, surprised by how steady my voice sounded. "They don't know. Maybe days, maybe hours." Mama was crying now, soft tears that I could hear through the phone line. "I know you two. I know it has been hard. But Dorothy, he's asking for you." Those words hit me like a physical blow. Charles Williams, the man who had spent my entire childhood making me feel invisible, was asking for me. After all these years of silence, of distance, of pretending we didn't exist to each other, he wanted to see me. "I don't know if I can, Mama," I whispered. "I understand, baby, I do. But what if you regret it later? What if you always wonder what might have been said?" I hung up the phone and stood in my kitchen for a long time, surrounded by the ordinary things of my life. Clean laundry, coffee cups in the sink, my children's school photos on the refrigerator. Everything looked the same, but something fundamental had shifted. The moment I had been unconsciously preparing for through months of prayer and counseling with Pastor James had arrived. When Robert came home for lunch that day, he found me sitting at our kitchen table with the phone number for Montgomery General Hospital written on a piece of paper in front of me. "Honey?" he said, setting down his lunchbox and looking at me with concern. "What's wrong?" "My father," I said, the words feeling strange in my mouth. "He's sick. He might not make it." Robert's face filled with confusion, then understanding, then something that looked like relief. "Your father?" But I thought, "I know what you thought. I know what I told you." I looked up at him, this good man who had loved me for 25 years without ever knowing the whole truth about who I was. "Robert, I need to tell you something. About my family. About who I really am." And there, in our kitchen with the afternoon sunlight streaming through the yellow curtains I had sewn with my own hands, I told my husband the truth, all of it. About Charles Williams and his demons from the war. About the house where fear lived. About the little girl who had learned to make herself invisible. About the lies I had told to protect myself, lies that had grown so big they had shaped our entire marriage. Robert listened without interrupting, his face cycling through surprise, hurt, understanding, and finally, compassion. When I finished talking, we sat in silence for a long moment. "Why didn't you tell me?" he asked finally. "Because I was afraid," I admitted. "Afraid you wouldn't love me if you knew where I came from. Afraid you'd see me as broken." Robert reached across the table and took my hands in his. "Dorothy, you could have told me you were raised by wolves and I still would have loved you. But this explains so much about the woman I married, about why you always seem to be carrying some heavy burden. Are you angry that I lied?" "I am sad," he said honestly. "Sad that you felt like you had to carry this alone. Sad that you didn't trust me enough to share it. But angry? No. I understand why you did what you did." That afternoon, we called our children and asked them to come over for dinner. Michael was 28 now, married with a baby of his own. Sarah was 26, working as a teacher in Birmingham. James was 23, fresh out of college and full of plans for his future. Sitting around our dinner table that evening, looking at these three beautiful people that Robert and I had raised together, I felt the weight of all the lies I had told them over the years. They had a grandfather they had never met, a man whose story had been erased from their family history because of my pain and fear. "Kids," I said when we had finished eating, "there is something your daddy and I need to tell you. Something about my family that I haven't been completely honest about." And I told them too. About Charles Williams, about why I had pretended he didn't exist, about the phone call from Mama, and the choice I now had to make. I watched their faces as they processed this information, saw confusion give way to understanding, and finally to compassion. "So, we have a grandfather we've never met?" Sarah asked quietly. "Yes. And he was probably going to pass away without us ever knowing him?" The pain in her voice broke my heart. "I'm sorry," I whispered. "I thought I was protecting you, but I realize now that I was protecting myself." Michael, my oldest, reached across the table and squeezed my hand. "Mama, we understand why you did what you did, but now what are you going to do?" That was the question, wasn't it? What was I going to do? The next morning, I called Pastor James and asked if we could meet. Sitting in his small office with the afternoon light filtering through stained glass windows, I told him about the phone call and the choice I was facing. "I don't know if I am strong enough," I admitted. "I've spent so many years building walls to protect myself from him. What if seeing him breaks me? What if it heals you?" Pastor James asked gently. "Dorothy, you've been preparing for this moment for months. You've been learning about forgiveness, about the power of grace to transform even the deepest wounds. Maybe this is God's way of giving you the chance to put what you've learned into practice. But what if he seeks still angry? What if he can to change, even now? Then you forgive him anyway, not because he deserves it, but because you deserve to be free from the prison of resentment you've been living in." That evening, I made the hardest decision of my life. I called Mama and told her I was coming. The drive to Montgomery General Hospital the next day was the longest 2 hours of my life. Robert insisted on coming with me, and I was grateful for his steady presence beside me in the car. We barely spoke during the drive, but his hand found mine and held it tight. Walking through those hospital corridors, following the room numbers until I found the one Mama had given me, I felt like I was walking toward my own execution. My heart was pounding so hard I was sure everyone could hear it. My hands were shaking. My mouth was dry. And then I was standing outside room 214, looking at a door that might as well have been the entrance to another world. Mama was sitting in a chair beside the bed when I walked in. She looked up at me with eyes full of relief and fear and hope all mixed together. "He's been sleeping most of the day," she whispered, "but he wakes up sometimes." I looked at the man in the bed and almost didn't recognize him. Charles Williams, who had loomed so large in my childhood memories, looked small and frail under the white hospital sheets. His face was gaunt, his breathing labored. His hands, which I remembered as so big and threatening, looked thin and weak where they rested on top of the blanket. This was the man I had spent 40 years running from? This was the monster who had shaped my entire understanding of fear and safety and love? I sat down in the chair on the other side of his bed and just looked at him. Without the anger and the drinking and the weight of whatever demons he carried from the war, he looked like what he had always been underneath it all, a broken man who had never learned how to heal. After about an hour, his eyes opened. They were cloudy from the medication, but when they focused on me, I saw recognition there, and something else that I hadn't expected to see. I saw tears. "Dorothy?" His voice was barely a whisper. "Yes, Daddy, I am here. I didn't think you'd come." Neither did I. We looked at each other across that hospital bed, and I felt 40 years of walls beginning to crumble. Not all at once, but slowly, like ice melting in the spring sun. "I'm sorry," he said, and those two words carried the weight of decades. I am sorry for everything, for the man I was, for the father I never learned how to be. I know, Daddy, the war, it broke something in me, and I let that brokenness hurt you and your mama. That wasn't right. You deserved better." Sitting there, looking into the eyes of this dying man who had caused me so much pain, I felt something shift inside my chest. The anger that I had carried for so long, the resentment that had shaped my adult life, the fear that had kept me prisoner in my own heart, all of it began to dissolve. "I forgive you," I said. And as the words left my mouth, I felt a weight lift from my shoulders that I had been carrying for so long I had forgotten what it felt like to stand up straight. His tears came harder then. "You shouldn't, he whispered. "You shouldn't, forgive me." "Maybe not," I said. "But I am choosing to anyway. Not because you deserve it, but because I deserve to be free. We talked for 3 hours that day, not about the past, but about the present. About my children, his grandchildren he had never met, about Robert and the life I had built, about Mama and how proud he was of the woman she had become despite everything. He told me about the nightmares that still came sometimes, about the men he had lost in France, about how he had never learned to talk about what he had seen and done during the war. He told me how he had tried to drink away the memories, how he had pushed everyone away because he was afraid of hurting them, but had ended up hurting us anyway. I used to watch you playing in the backyard, he said, his voice so quiet I had to lean forward to hear him. You were always talking to someone who wasn't there. Your mama told me you were talking to your real daddy, the one who loved you. It broke my heart because I wanted to be that daddy, but I didn't know how. And why didn't you try? I asked, not with anger, but with genuine curiosity. Because I was scared, he admitted. Scared that if you got too close, you would see what I really was. All the darkness I was carrying. I thought it was better to keep you at a distance than to let you see how broken I was. But Daddy, I said, tears running down my cheeks. I was already broken. We all were. Maybe if we had been broken together, we could have helped each other heal. Softly and slowly, carefully, like people learning to walk again after a long illness, we began to build something that had never existed between us before. Not the father-daughter relationship I had dreamed of as a child. It was too late for that. But something new. Something built on honesty and forgiveness and the recognition that we were both just human beings trying to find our way through a complicated world. I told him about Michael, Sarah, and James. About how Michael had become a mechanic like Robert, working with his hands and building things instead of tearing them down. About how Sarah had become a teacher, spending her days helping children learn to read and discover the world through books. About how James was studying to become a counselor, wanting to help people work through their pain and find healing. They sound like good kids, Daddy said. They are. Robert made sure of that. He's the kind of father you wanted to be. I am glad, he said, and I could see that he meant it. I am glad you found someone who could love you the way you deserve to be loved. That night, I stayed at the hospital. Mama went home to rest, but I couldn't to bring myself to leave. I sat beside his bed, watching him sleep, thinking about all the years we had lost, all the conversations we had never had, all the love that had gotten tangled up in fear and pain and misunderstanding. But I also thought about the miracle of forgiveness, about how God had brought us to this moment when it seemed impossible, about how healing could happen even in the last days, the last hours, the last moments of a life. Daddy passed away 2 days later. I was holding his hand when it happened, and his last words to me were, "Thank you for coming back to me." Mama and I planned his funeral together. For the first time in decades, we talked openly about the man he had been, the mistakes he had made, but also the love he had carried underneath all that pain. We decided to have the service at the Baptist church, where I had found my own healing, where Pastor James could speak about redemption and grace and the power of forgiveness to transform even the most broken relationships. At his funeral, I stood up and spoke about him for the first time in my adult life, not as the monster from my childhood, but as a man who had struggled with demons bigger than himself, a man who had made mistakes, but who had also loved us in the only broken way he knew how. My father wasn't a perfect, I said, looking out at the small congregation of family and friends. He made choices that hurt the people he loved most. But in his final days, he showed me something important about the nature of grace. He showed me that it's never too late to ask for forgiveness, and it's never too late to offer it. I talked about the little girl who had spent so many years saying she did not have a father, and how that little girl had finally learned that acknowledging her father's existence, flaws and all, was the key to her own freedom. After the service, people came up to me with their own stories. Neighbors who had known Daddy during his drinking years, but had also seen him trying to get sober in recent months. Co-workers from the lumber mill who remembered him as a hard worker who kept to himself, but would always help a colleague in need. Veterans from his American Legion post who understood the weight he had carried from the war. I realized that Charles Williams had been more than just my father. He had been a man with his own story, his own struggles, his own small acts of kindness that I had never known about. Hearing these stories didn't erase the pain he had caused, but it helped me see him as a complete human being rather than just the source of my childhood trauma. After the service, Robert and I drove back to our house on Elm Street. Sitting on our front porch that evening, watching the sun set over our neighborhood, I felt different, lighter, like I had finally put down a heavy suitcase I had been carrying for 40 years. "How do you feel?" Robert asked. "I'm free," I said, and meant it. "For the first time in my life, I feel completely free." "What are you going to do with all that freedom?" he asked, smiling. I said slowly, "I'm going to help other people find theirs." But there was still one more thing I needed to do. The following Sunday, I stood up in front of our small congregation at the Baptist church and told my story. All of it. About the lies I had told, about the forgiveness I had found, about the healing that was possible even for the deepest wounds. For 40 years, I said, looking out at faces I had known for decades, I thought the safest thing to do was pretend my father didn't exist. I thought that if I could just erase him from my story, I could erase the pain he had caused. But what I learned is that denying the truth doesn't heal anything. It just keeps the wound from ever properly closing. I talked about how the lie had shaped my marriage, my relationship with my children, my understanding of myself. I talked about the freedom that came with telling the truth, even when the truth was complicated and painful. Forgiveness, I said, doesn't mean pretending that wrong things didn't happen. It doesn't mean putting yourself back in harm's way. It means choosing to release the hold that anger and resentment have on your heart. It means deciding that your future matters more than your past. After the service, people came up to me with their own stories. Stories of estranged family members, of old wounds they had been carrying, of forgiveness they had been afraid to offer. I realized that my story wasn't unique. We all have people we've tried to erase, pain we've tried to deny, forgiveness we've been afraid to give. Mrs. Henderson, who had sat 3 pews behind us for 15 years, told me about the son who had left home angry and never come back. "I don't even know if he is alive," she whispered, tears in her eyes. "But after hearing your story, I think maybe it is time to try to find him." Young Tommy Marshall, barely 18 and angry at the world, told me about his father who had walked out when Tommy was 12. "I've been telling people he's gone forever," Tommy said. "But maybe he is not." Pastor James pulled me aside after most people had left. "Dorothy," he said, "I think God is calling you to something bigger than just your own healing. I think He wants you to help other people find the same freedom you've found." And that is how I started my real life work. Working with Pastor James, we created a support group for people struggling with family estrangement and the process of forgiveness. We called it Healing Hearts, and we met every Wednesday evening in the church fellowship hall. It started with just me and Mrs. Henderson and Tommy Marshall. But word spread, and soon we had 12 people, then 20, then more than we could fit in the fellowship hall. We had to move to the main sanctuary. People came from all over Alabama to share their stories and learn about forgiveness. Women who had been hurt by their fathers. Men who had never known how to show love to their children. Couples whose marriages had been damaged by secrets and lies. Teenagers who were angry at parents they felt had let them down. I learned that my story was both unique and universal. The details were different, but the pain was the same. The need for healing was the same. The possibility of redemption was the same. Over the following months, I started counseling other women who had experienced similar trauma. Not as a professional. I never went back to school for that. But as someone who had walked the path from brokenness to healing and could help others find their way. My relationship with my children deepened too. No longer having to protect the secret of Charles Williams, I was able to share stories about my childhood, about Mama E.S. strength, about the complexity of family relationships. They began to understand their mother in ways they never had before. "Mama," Sarah said to me one day when she came to visit with her own children, "I understand now why you were always so protective of us, why you seemed to worry more than other mothers. You were trying to make sure we never felt the way you felt as a child." "Yes," I said, "but I realize now that trying to protect you from all pain isn't possible or even healthy. What I should have done was teach you how to deal with pain when it comes, how to find healing when you hurt, how to forgive when forgiveness seems impossible. You'd be teaching us that now, she said. Maybe that cost is what matters? Michael started bringing his own son, little Robert, to visit more often. Watching him play in the same backyard where I had once talked to my imaginary father, I felt the circle of healing continue. Little Robert would never know his great-grandfather, Charles Williams, but he would grow up in a family that understood the power of forgiveness, the importance of truth, and the possibility of redemption. I wish we could have met him, Sarah said to me one day. Not because he was perfect, but because he was part of our story. Maybe, I said. But maybe the story needed to happen this way. Maybe I needed to learn about forgiveness before I could teach it to you. Maybe God had to break me before he could use me to help heal others. James, my youngest, struggled the most with the revelation about his grandfather. How do we know he really changed? He asked me one evening. How do we know he wasn't just trying to make himself feel better before he passed away? We don't TT, I said honestly. That is the thing about forgiveness. It is not about whether the other person deserves it or whether they be really changed. It's about choosing freedom for yourself. I forgave your grandfather not because he earned it, but because I needed to be free from the anger I was carrying. But what if he hadn't been sorry? What if he had been just as mean and angry in the hospital as he was when you were a child? Then I would have forgiven him anyway, I said. Because forgiveness isn't about them. It is about us. It is about refusing to let their brokenness keep us broken. Gradually, James began to understand. He started volunteering with our Healing Hearts group, using his natural empathy and his studies in counseling to help other young people work through their own family pain. Now, sitting here on my porch at 72 years old, I think about that scared little girl who decided the best way to deal with pain was to pretend it didn't exist. My heart breaks for her, but I also understand her. She was just trying to survive in the only way she knew how. But survival isn't the same as living. And I spent 40 years surviving instead of living. It wasn't until I learned to face the truth about my father, about myself, about the ways that love and pain can get all tangled up together, that I was finally able to really live. Forgiveness didn't happen overnight. It was a choice I had to make over and over again, especially in those moments when the old anger tried to creep back in. But each time I chose forgiveness over resentment, freedom over prison, love over fear, I felt myself becoming more of the woman God meant me to be. 13 years have passed since Daddy went home to be with the Lord. 13 years of helping other people find the same freedom I found. 13 years of watching marriages heal, families reunite, and hearts that seem too broken to mend discover that God's grace is bigger than any wound. Now, sitting here on my porch at 72 years old, I think about that scared little girl who decided the best way to deal with pain was to pretend it didn't exist. My heart breaks for her, but I also understand her. She was just trying to survive in the only way she knew how. But survival isn't the same as living. And I spent 40 years surviving instead of living. It wasn't until I learned to face the truth about my father, about myself, about the ways that love and pain can get all tangled up together, that I was finally able to really live. Forgiveness didn't happen overnight. It was a choice I had to make over and over again, especially in those moments when the old anger tried to creep back in. But each time I chose forgiveness over resentment, freedom over prison, love over fear, I felt myself becoming more of the woman God meant me to be. Charles Williams wasn't a perfect father. He wasn't even a good father, if we were being honest. But he was my father, and denying that truth kept me from ever fully becoming myself, accepting it, forgiving it, and choosing to build my life on something stronger than the pain he caused. That's what finally set me free. If you are listening to this story and you recognize yourself in it, if you have someone in your life you've been trying to erase or pain you've been trying to deny, I want you to know that there's another way. Forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting. It doesn't mean excusing behavior that was wrong. It doesn't mean putting yourself back in harm's way. Forgiveness means choosing freedom over prison. It means deciding that your future is more important than your past. It means believing that God, as love, is bigger than anyone, as mistakes, including your own. It means understanding that the people who hurt us are often people who were hurt themselves, and that breaking the cycle of pain is one of the most powerful things we can do in this world. Today, when my granddaughter Sarah asks me about her great-grandfather, I tell her the truth, that he was a complicated man who struggled with demons from a war, that he made mistakes that hurt people he loved, but also that he was capable of change, of apology, of love in his final moments. I tell her that our family story isn't perfect, but it is real, and that sometimes the most beautiful chapters are the ones where people find the courage to choose healing over hurting, forgiveness over revenge, love over fear. Charles Williams passed away 13 years ago now, but the lessons he taught me in those final days, not through his words, but through the opportunity he gave me to practice grace, those lessons live on. They live on in the women I counsel who are learning to forgive their own difficult families. They live on in my children who understand that families are complicated, but that love is always worth fighting for. And they live on in me, a 72-year-old woman who finally learned that the father she spent so many years denying was actually the key to her own freedom. If you take anything from my story, let it be this: it is never too late to choose healing. It is never too late to tell the truth. It is never too late to forgive. And it is never too late to discover that the very thing you've been running from might be exactly what you need to finally, truly, completely set you free. The little girl who used to say, "I don't have a father," learned in the end that admitting she did have a father, a flawed, broken, struggling father who loved her in the only way he knew how, was the beginning of becoming the woman she was always meant to be. And that woman, the one sitting here talking to you now, wants you to know that whatever truth you've been hiding from, whatever forgiveness you've been afraid to offer, whatever healing you've been putting off, now is the time. God is calling you toward freedom, just like He called me. All you have to do is say yes, and trust that His love is big enough to catch you when you finally let go of the pain you've been holding on to for so long. Thank you for listening to my story. Thank you for allowing me to share this journey with you. And if you've been touched by what you've heard today, please share it with someone who might need to hear it too, because that is how healing spreads. One story at a time, one heart at a time, one act of forgiveness at a time. God bless you all.